Good morning and good afternoon to everyone here today. To the officers and staff, thank you for your coordination and efforts. I think for everyone so far into this pandemic, we know that these digital gatherings aren't as straightforward as one might think, and it requires just as much planning and attentiveness to make seamless. So for everyone, please pass your thanks when you have the opportunity or even in the chat throughout today. And speaking of today, my appreciation to you listening to this presentation now very personally and humbly for having the genuine care and interest on topics that will affect us all, on issues that will underpin conversations for a generation. My name is Michael KANAAN, and it's my pleasure to moderate this first panel today. When the staff first reached out a few months ago planning this event, they had a simple yet profoundly impactful premise. What does winning look like nowadays? Can you win without victory as traditionally understood? Points versus points on a scoreboard, comparing number of goals to number of goals on the pitch, conventional overmatch. Well, the simple answer is it depends on who you ask. And we've circled this question and drawn out affairs and quagmires with no end in sight. But now, the character, the complexity of that question will be far greater. The indecisiveness that will result from questions such as what is real, how many variables are on the battlefield, and where does that battlefield even reside? How do those instruments of diplomatic, information, military, and economic power work when they seem so much like one now? All the while understanding that humanity's impact on the environment has and will only surely more impact all these questions and confusions. Entering the age of learning technology, both good and bad, is an inflection point. Things will change, but what's not so new is people. People and the future leaders of lore will help guide us through. And that's why I'm excited to share with you our panel members today. Each of them will share their comments and thoughts on the topic of challenges reinforcing indecisiveness. And at the end, we'll be asking your questions. So again, throughout today and on this panel, drop your questions in the comments. We're very much looking forward to a lively discussion. With that, I'd like to introduce Ms Alexandra STICKING. She is a research fellow for space policy and security in the military sciences team at RUSI, where her research covers military space programs, space warfare, counter space capabilities, space situational awareness, arms control, and the intersection of space and missile defense. She's written articles and research papers for a variety of publications, articles I truly enjoy and read. She frequently speaks to share those incredible insights on international stages and holds advanced degrees in international security, global governance from Birkbeck College, University of London, and BAs in international studies from the Open University and a BS in physics with astronomy from the University of Nottingham. Truly embodies the idea that learning is a lifetime sport. We all have a ton to learn. Over to you, Ms. STICKING.
Michael, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak today. So the title of my talk I was given was More Actors in a Larger and Unpredictable Battlefield. And the battlefield I'm going to be talking about is space. I use that as an example. The landscape of space has changed quite dramatically since the beginning of the first space age. We look from the late 1950s, early 1960s to now. When it started, it was two states, US and Soviet Union. And that was very much everything was happening within the background context of the Cold War. What we have now, as I said, is very different. We have so many more actors, more states, and also commercial companies. And that is only increasing. So what we have just from that is a much more complex environment and having to balance the ambitions and the intents of all these different actors. So space now is referred, the narrative is that space is no longer a sanctuary. I do disagree with this slightly that it wasn't, but I think the idea that space is purely peaceful, that it's only used for peaceful purposes is pretty much, I agree that's no longer true. So we have this very complex, very contested environment. And the first part of that is just in the number of satellites. There are approximately 2,000 to 3,000 functioning satellites at the moment, and that is increasing very rapidly. We see particularly mega constellations from private companies like SpaceX, which are planning on putting tens of thousands of satellites into orbit. Most of this is occurring in low Earth orbit, but we're also seeing increases in medium Earth and geostationary orbit as well. So how do we manage that? Along with the number of satellites, we also have increasing amounts of space debris. Some of this is naturally occurring, just satellites breaking up, but some of this is also from kinetic strikes against satellites and collisions between them. So how do we manage this debris? How do we understand where it's moving? How do we ensure that collisions aren't happening? So we need space situational awareness and space traffic management in order to do this. The difficulty is that this has primarily been a function of militaries. So a lot of the information is classified. It's how do we ensure that that information is best shared internationally amongst all actors to try and manage what is happening in space. Alongside the number of satellites and the management of the traffic, we also have an increase in counter space capabilities. I use this term very strongly, not space weapons. Trying to define a weapon in space is incredibly difficult. And the term counter space capability also allows us to include those threats to the non-space-based aspects of these architectures. So it could be the jamming of terrestrial receivers, the targeting of ground stations, cyber attacks, and the like. And these span quite a huge spectrum. So on one side, one end, we have kinetic anti-satellite missiles, these destroy a satellite, increasing a huge amount of debris as well, which is one of the main problems with them. Moving through a number of non-kinetic capabilities. So we're looking at the development of lasers which can actually dazzle the optical sensors of satellites, the use of high-powered microwave frequencies, for example, to interfere with internal electronics, cyber capabilities, rendezvous and proximity operations, satellites being able to approach other satellites. We don't necessarily know what they might be doing. We have GPS jamming, spoofing of GPS signals. So we have this whole range of capabilities there. And tied to that as well, we have dual use technologies. On one side, again, there's two parts to this. We have those satellites which are dual use in terms of civilian and military. So that might be in terms of ISR or communications. But we also have the development of technologies for civilian or scientific purposes, which could be repurposed. And those are based around rendezvous and proximity operations, particularly in terms of debris removal or on-orbit satellite servicing. So we're looking at people who are developing satellites to approach an old broken satellite or large piece of debris, actually capture it and drag it into the atmosphere, remove it from orbit. Of course, if you can do that to a piece of debris, you can do it to a functioning satellite. There are, of course, a lot of legal issues here as well, but there is definitely concern about some of these technologies and how they might be used. And of course, space, there are lots of things that we can't control. One of those aspects we're most worried about is solar activity, is space weather. A massive solar event which could cause a huge amount of damage to satellites in orbit. And how do we plan for that? So we have this incredibly complex environment that we're all trying to function in. And it means that military activity in space isn't always clear-cut. It's not always obvious. There could be a lot of confusion. We have concerns about attribution and proving intent as well, and miscalculation. Which could lead to a response where it's maybe unwarranted. If your satellite stops functioning, it's not easy always to know the reason why. You can't just go up to it and pull it apart and figure out what happened. It could have been a micro debris strike. It could have been some radiation, could just be a fault. It could be nefarious activity. So when we have more actors, dual purpose capabilities and all these different things going on, it can mean even understanding that and proving any activity is so much more difficult, which again is why we need this sharing of information to actually understand, to be able to have a better view of what happened, to ensure that if we are responding to an action, we know how we should be doing that and why. And of course, this complexity, this confusion is only going to keep increasing as we move into the future. We are going to continue to see more actors come in, whether that's more commercial companies, more civilian agencies, and also more military actors. We had the US, we had the Soviet Union. US and Russia are still huge players here. China is now a major military space player. The UK now has a director space. We're going to have a space command. France has been making moves in this direction. India, Japan, NATO has now declared space as an operational domain. So we're going to see a lot more military activity, not necessarily in terms of targeting satellites, but in the use of space. And alongside that, also the potential for the use of proxies, which just adds another level of complexity. I mentioned the commercial companies, again, more and more of these. And we're also going to see them having almost more of a majority stake in space. The number of satellites is going to far outweigh the military, the state-based satellites. And also some of them have a bit of technological supremacy. They can take risks that states often can't. We see this particularly with SpaceX and their ability to reuse rockets. And we're going to continue, I think, to see commercial companies developing some capabilities that are surpassing state-based and military-based capabilities. We're also going to see increased activity in the lunar area. Maybe aware that a few years ago, China landed a rover on the far side of the moon. And whilst this was a very significant technical achievement, it also did create some concern about whether the moon was going to be a new strategic high ground. There is a lot of debate about that. What do we mean by a high ground and whether that's true? But although the lunar missions that are being planned are, about science and about exploration, the technologies required to do these could again cause some concern. And also there is just that sort of power play, that balance in space that we see, particularly between the big actors. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. A little bit further into the future, we're going to see things like asteroid mining potentially. There's estimated to be trillions of dollars worth of resources on asteroids. So the ability to bring these resources back, lots of economic impacts, lots of legal impacts, the potential of on-orbit manufacturing as well, and how that might change the capabilities that states have. So we just have, it's like an onion, you just keep layers and layers and layers of complexity about how we operate in space. But of course, some of the big questions are, what is the potential for an actual conflict in space? People often talk about this. Are we going to have a real war, a shooting war in space? And so there are some arguments as to why this is not necessarily the narrative to go down. First off, is the use of counter space capabilities, certain ones. We know that states have tested kinetic ASAT missiles. There was a very infamous 2007 Chinese test, an Indian test. Russia has been testing some of the capabilities in the last year. But these produce a huge amount of debris. And that affects everyone in space. It is an overt, aggressive act if you do this to another state satellite. So there are questions as to whether these would be used, or whether this is about deterrence, it's about projecting your own power and posturing in space. So are these counter space capabilities that are likely to be used more in that sub-threshold, that constant competition? And it's more the short-term denial of space rather than destroying satellites. We see a lot of move towards creating norms of behavior in space. This is to try and catch up a little bit with the technology in terms of international agreements and treaties. The Outer Space Treaty is quite old. So how do we understand norms? How do we look at rendezvous and proximity operations, and how close you can get to other satellites in sort of agreed distances beyond which you're within your rights to say you're too close. I can respond. We do have ongoing discussions in the arms control community about some of these counter space capabilities. Some concern as to whether these are realistic, but we do expect perhaps some movement in this way. And I think the biggest is that space is so important in so many different areas. It's not just the military, it's national security, it's economics, the international financial system and trade. And so anything that leads to the loss of use of space is going to have huge global impacts. You can't guarantee that any action you take will not affect you. So the question really, does anyone want a conflict in space, or are we going to see that, that fear of crossing a line into a full-blown conflict? There is no winner there. And I think, winning in this context is just the continued ability to operate in space and to freely operate in space. It's either that, and we learn how to continue within a complex environment, within with knowing about these capabilities and how to deal with them, or everyone loses. People like to talk about a new space race, but how do we guarantee a winner there? I think that understanding that there is no winner, that we shouldn't necessarily approach our operations in that way, is perhaps the best route to take to ensure that space continues to be of benefit to all of us. I think I'll finish there, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Alexandra. Moving forward, it is my pleasure to introduce Peter Singer. Peter is a strategist at New America, a professor of practice at Arizona State University, and principal at Useful Fiction. Described in the Wall Street Journal as the premier futurist in the national security environment, he has been named by the Smithsonian as one of the nation's 100 leading innovators, by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, by Foreign Policy to their top 100 global thinkers list, and as an official mad scientist to the US Army's Training and Doctrine Command, a title I'm also so glad to share with you, Peter. And I can speak personally when I say he's a thought leader to so many of us, because we humans, we learn best by and through storytelling. And his books are stories I've read for years, and you should too. Whether it's his books such as Ghost Fleet or Like War, named Book of the Year by Amazon and Foreign Affairs, reviewed with words like, quote, should be required reading for everyone living in democracy and all who aspire to. Personally inspirational, though, he is also the co-author of a new type of novel, using the format of techno-thriller to communicate nonfiction research. His latest, Burn-In, a novel of the real robotic revolution, was both a top summer read and led to briefings everywhere from the White House to the Pentagon, briefings I've received. So it's my pleasure to hand it over to you now, Peter.
So thank you very much for the incredibly kind introduction, and also want to express my appreciation to the organizers for bringing us all together for this fascinating, important discussion. I know at a certain point you're going to get tired of looking at my face on the screen. So if the technology will allow us here, we're going to shift over to share screen. And great, there we go. And there's much discussion today in defense circles, and particularly when it comes to this question of how we think about winning in war or not, around the question of the strategic surprise, the unexpected that we're not properly planning for in the realm of war that might lead to that great defeat or that great victory. Now, my contention, though, is that whatever is that next strategic surprise is not the so-called black swan, some kind of singular, unimaginable coming at us, but rather it's more like the gray rhino. It's obvious, it's big, it's just uncomfortable to stare at. In many ways, we can think about the situation that we were all in almost exactly 1 year ago, where we had the gray rhino of the pandemic staring at us. It was obvious, it was big, and some governments responded appropriately, and others, for example, my own, chose to look away. And it's part of why we're still working from home right now, a full year later. So what is that big obvious in the realm of war that's coming at us, but it's sort of uncomfortable to wrestle with its full implications? It's artificial intelligence and the accompanying aspects of increasingly autonomous robotics. Now, when I say that, I don't think I'm saying something all that revolutionary. Many people recognize this. Indeed, there have not just been studies by leading, governments and strategy cells, as well as alliances like NATO, but it also comes out in surveys. There was a survey taken, and 91% of leaders say that AI is the most important game-changing technology that is out there. But honestly, I don't think that we are anywhere near to recognizing or wrestling with what that truly means. I think our best parallel is to the battleship captains back in a little around 100 years back. So you think of the interwar years of the 1920s and 30s, where immediately after World War I, there was a debate back and forth between the airplane and the battleship, but as to which mattered or not. But the debate evolved, and by the 1930s, the battleship captains thought that they got it. They'd say previously it said airplane doesn't matter. Now by the 1930s, it said, no, don't you tell me that I'm against airplanes. I get it. I truly understand it. In fact, I'm giving up valuable deck space on my battleship. I'm giving up valuable budget to put airplanes on the back of my battleship. And the airplane, it's going to make my battleship more lethal, more powerful than it's ever been before in history. The airplane is going to allow it to sight the enemy fleet at distance. The airplane is going to allow my battleship cannon to be that much more accurate. So I truly get the future. And of course, what they were doing was just changing enough not to change. They truly didn't get what the airplane meant for war and the battleship. Or for our ground warfare friends, it'd be a parallel like this. This is an image from a US Army training exercise in 1931, where they got it. They got that the machine gun had changed war, one of the lessons coming out of World War I. And they got it and said, you know what, we truly understand it. We're not opposed to it. It's not a question of machine gun or horse cavalry. The machine gun is going to make our horse cavalry more lethal than it's ever been before. We can mount it on the back of a horse-drawn wagon. We truly get the future. Instead, we can see changes go well beyond that, sort of layering on to existing beliefs, existing systems. In the coming years with robotics, they will not just become increasingly autonomous, but will play out in all sorts of different sizes, shapes, form, roles. But importantly, they won't just be in our hands, they will be in our adversaries' hands, or rather not directly operating our hands. And these range from great state powers, like the images you see here of Russian and Chinese made systems, but much like in the Cold War, how it was not just the Red Army that flew MiG-21s or used AK-47s, but it was non-state and other state actors around the world. The same thing will happen with robotic systems, including those made by Russia and China, as they proliferate out around the world. So you will face them not just contending against a powerful state, but against a weak state, but also against a non-state actor. All of this technology, though, will be not just intelligent and increasingly robotic, but it's networked. And that means that we will see a rewiring of our world, our lives, our cities, but it also means that we will see new kinds of threats going at it. Cyber attacks that are not merely about the theft of information, but increasingly about causing a change in the physical environment that is using digital means to cause physical damage. And as you can see here, a link, a reference to the book that Michael mentioned, Burn-In, where we explored how, I don't want to plot ruin it, but how someone can use digital means to create versions of the 10 biblical plagues, but in a real world city. And not imagined, but all possible. And in fact, you might have seen recently news in both Israel and the United States where the scenario of water treatment plants targeting has played out just months after the book came out. This shift means a massive rethink of the battlefield. Everything from potential new tactics, new doctrines, new organizations. It's happened in the past. Think what the machine gun and rapid firing artillery meant for the battlefield and how militaries responded to it in 1914. Or think what the armored tank, wireless communication with the radio, the flying machine, the airplane meant for warfare in 1940 and the Blitzkrieg. Why would we expect AI and robotics to be any different? But I would add, AI is a tool, a technology that is different than the tank or the machine gun because it's intelligent. It's always improving. And that means that you have a capacity to take it into new realms that we've not even wrestled with when it comes to doctrine or tactics before. But it's more than that. An Oxford University examination of 702 jobs, 702 different occupations, found that roughly 47% are at risk for replacement or reduction by robotics and AI within the next 2 decades. So this is a not just a revolution in terms of what you might think of the technology of war, but more like an industrial revolution. And what's important for war, though, is that each of those occupational specialties that will see transformation in terms of reduction or complete elimination on the civilian side, every single one of them has a military parallel. So too much of the narrative around robotics and war is the armed killer robot debate, which is a misnomer when we see instead maybe some of the key shifts will be in medicine, in logistics, you name it. But here again, go back to that notion of an industrial revolution. There's something larger at play. The shift will be historic. As the director of MIT's Media Lab described, quote, every area of life will be affected, every single one. Think about the last industrial revolution, mechanization, how it yielded new economic winners and losers at the individual, at the business, at the national, global level, how it spawned everything from mass consumer goods to global climate change. It led to mass movements of populations to mass political movements. And in turn, these range from positives. If there had been no industrial revolution, there would be no workers' rights, no women's rights, no children's rights. All of those come out of the industrial revolution. Oh, by the way, if there had been no industrial revolution, there likely would not have been fascism, communism that also came out of that. Issues that we would spend the next century working our way through, including in warfare. Why should we think this will be the different one? So what can we do to prepare for this world and the broader challenges that come? I'd suggest 3 things. The first, much like we're doing here, education and awareness is key. We need to do a better job as leaders and organizations to understand these trends. For example, go back to that data point. If 91% of leaders say, AI, I get it, it's the most important technology out there. What percentage of leaders do you think say that they understand it? They understand how it works, how it will be used. The answer is 17%. That is a massive delta between people, 91% saying it's the most important thing and 17% saying, I get it. We need to close that gap. We can't even expect that we'll handle it well if we don't close that gap. Second, we need to be better able to visualize the future and prepare for it. I would offer up a couple of ways of this. The first is too much of our wargaming and training right now is about validating existing concepts, getting back to basics, rather than doing that kind of parallel of the 1920s and 30s of learning what is new and how we deal with it. The second is, as Michael referenced, I think we need to use more and more new means of communication to help people visualize. We found it easier to teach about the future using what we call packages of useful fiction. This is not science fiction like I know the French military has recently explored. It's not dreaming up anything. It's taking nonfiction research, following all of those rules, but packaging it through vignettes, scenarios that are designed to carry that over, a blend of narrative and nonfiction to yield an understanding and a readership that normal white papers don't achieve. You can think of useful fiction as actually what I did to my children just 30 minutes ago. I snuck fruit and veggies into their morning smoothie. Useful fiction is the same, except for policymakers who are tired of reading white papers. Finally, we need to kill our sacred cows. What is the equivalent of the horse cavalry in 1939? What is the equivalent today of the battleship in 1939 that we are unwilling to give up when maybe we ought to? But this is not just about weapon systems. Sacred cows can also be about organizational structures. Think about our org charts, how we do command and control. Were they designed for the world that we are in now, let alone the world to come? I would argue not. And there's a lesson in this and how it leads to success or failure. To use US military defeats, great ones from our history, General Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn, he had machine guns assigned to his unit. He didn't understand them. He thought of them as artillery, so he left them back at the base. We would remember General Custer very differently if he had grasped the future of machine guns. Or in World War II, the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the first great US ground warfare defeat. Our army had tanks, our army had aircraft, our army had radio. We had seen what had happened to France in the Blitzkrieg. And yet, because of poor organization, command and control, an inability to not just recognize, but wrestle with change, we lose. So in closing, I would say the key issue here is for all of us to be change-oriented. We're clearly in a time of change. And whether it is as an individual, an organization, or as a nation, if you are not wrestling with that change, you are making a deliberate choice to lose the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Inspirational words. And lastly, over to Dr. OLAF CORRY. He is a professor of global security challenges at University of Leeds. Currently, his research focuses on how international and environmental politics intersect. In particular, international politics of climate change and the security implications of climate geoengineering. He teaches security studies and international relations and the environment, and has previously worked at the University of Copenhagen, the Open University, and the University of Cambridge. He has published widely on international environmental politics and security in diverse journals such as Review of International Studies, Global Environmental Change, International Relations, and many more. His book, Constructing a Global Polity, Theory, Discourse, and Governance, argues that global objects of governments, such as the climate, structure the international system. Right after his PhD, he worked at the Danish Parliament as a speechwriter and political advisor on matters of security, foreign policy, and climate change. I hope I share with you all the inspiration and required attentiveness in reading from this remarkable body of work. Dr. CORRY, over to you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction as well, and for the already very stimulating presentations on this panel, which I hope I can do justice to and follow up on. So I'm going to talk about the pursuit of climate security and how that fits into the theme of today around winning without victory. So I'm going to just share my screen as well. Hope this all works. as per planned. So in a way, there's a strange anomaly in the concept of climate security, because we're used to thinking about the climate in terms of economic development, in terms of environmental protection, in terms of the biosphere. Whereas security as a field, as you all know, as security professionals in one way or another, is a completely different field in many ways, one where you have an adversary, at least in many cases, and where extraordinary measures and extreme measures are permitted, because security, the nature of security as a political problem, is of that nature. So what does pursuing climate security really mean? I'm going to try and explore that with you. So here we go. So first of all, it's not many months ago, I'd say, since climate security was actually quite a marginal interest. Maybe not for some of you, but in the general mainstream discourse about climate change, climate security was not the top of the agenda. I think that has changed radically, and maybe the election of Joe Biden is part of that. So, but I'm going to quote something from the Dutch Institute for Planetary Security Initiative, which puts the conundrum quite clearly. I think climate change is a new enemy. It has no flag, no leader, no competence, nor a revolutionary manifesto. But it is a killer of people. It is operating worldwide to destabilize societies, and it is gaining strength. You see here a clear framing of climate as a security problem. We've seen Joe Biden, one of his first executive actions was to order a 17 intelligence agency-wide review of the national security threat emanating from climate change. So all the intelligence agencies are now being charged with working through what climate security actually means and making an assessment of that. And John Kerry, the new US climate envoy, who will sit as for the first time, he in that position will sit on the National Security Council, I believe. So you have a sort of securitization of the climate and the climate challenge, which is quite striking. But what does it actually mean? If there is no enemy, if it has no flag, if it has no leader, if it has no competence, if it doesn't have a revolutionary manifesto, what does it actually mean to win climate security as a security problem? Well, last week in New York, this just underscores the point in one way. Last week in New York, of course, it was on the Security Council's agenda. And it's not the first time. It happened, I think, for the first time in 2007. But there were debates, and certain members and permanent members of the Security Council objected to it being there, of course. Boris Johnson was not one of those objecting. But this is just taken directly from his speech, as an excerpt from his speech last week, and it picks out some of the ways in which the idea of security is translated, the idea of climate change as a problem is translated into a security problem. And this is the way that the political sphere speaks about it. This is what I'm interested in here. So I'm just picking out certain of the phrases here. I don't need to read this whole thing, but he talks about a young man forced onto the road when his home becomes a desert and when people are displaced. So migration, climate-driven migration, is an incredibly strong meme in this whole climate security discourse. He goes to some camp. He becomes prey for violent extremists. Okay, so we have climate change generating violent extremism, according to this political discourse, radicalization. And then the girl, this is perhaps the victim narrative. She becomes, because of climate change and the daily search for water, gets into the clutches of human traffickers, international criminal gangs. So we have a sort of merging of climate, firstly with terrorism, secondly with international organized crime, human trafficking. And then the third person he evokes is a farmer who's lost his harvest after droughts and then switches to poppies. So you have a kind of war on drugs meme coming into this climate security discourse as well. And then you have the idea of impoverished and fragile nation, so the failed states idea, and the idea of shock waves of instability emanating from climate change as well. And he rounds off that passage by saying, now, if that kind of result in terms of political, economic, humanitarian impact, if that was triggered by some kind of despotic warlord or civil war, then nobody would question the right and the duty of this UN Security Council to act. Now, that's a big if. But this is the way that climate is being funneled into the security sphere. A lot of these are actually empirically quite dubious. So there isn't a consensus on the established relationship between climatic changes and levels of conflict. But that's a whole other debate, which I won't have time to go into here. But so what I'm talking about is at the political level, how climate becomes a security issue. And of course, how the political system interprets the climate problem will define what it means to win or to lose, of course. There is no objective sense of winning against the climate. In many ways, that goes for some of the things Professor Heuser said as well, that the purpose of the war in itself is a political question beyond the military one as well. So I'm going to disentangle all these ideas and give you 4 ideal types for what climate security means, dividing them up according to what is it that's actually threatened and what is it that's doing the threatening. So type 1 is the closest, I guess, to this community of practice, which is the idea that climate change threatens national security. It's what is threatened in climate security is the critical national interests. So there's no basic change in that. It's just translating the national security ideas and adding climate to it. So what is threatened is perhaps military assets that can't operate under extreme weather conditions, capabilities, dealing with new types of proliferating threats, as Boris Johnson's speech elaborates. The idea of who is doing this is very much linked to the idea of climate-driven migration and causal chains or narratives about causal change, that this leads to terrorism, destabilization, but also the direct threat of extreme weather. Type 2 is also alluded to in Boris Johnson's speech, but it's a different kind of argument. The argument here is that what is threatened is actually international peace and stability. So it's a question of order. And here are lots of theories about how climate change will create scarcity, for example, will disrupt borders. And the idea that scarcity drives climate is, of course, controversial. Some people think it's abundance of resources that really drives conflict. But this is a sort of neo-Malthusian meme, which is built into this discourse as well. So the idea that what is threatened by the climate change in terms of security is international peace and security. And there, the military's role is rather one of stabilization as opposed to defense. Of course, these two will always be related. In fact, all of them will be. Type 3, to move on to that one, has climate security as being basically a version of human security, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, a doctrine of security which tries to reframe security practices as being fundamentally a question not about defending sovereign states, but about, in the end, securing human lives, human rights. Sometimes it's formulated in a very liberal sense in terms of securing human rights, or in a broader one about human welfare. So poverty reduction would be a kind of human security in this discourse normally. But in terms of that idea of climate security, climate is a security problem because it's threatening human lives, rights, welfare of individuals, but also of communities. And here it's more directly a question of floods, famines, droughts, etc., all the expected increased extreme weather that goes with climate change, and the ensuing food security and basic habitat security that comes out of that. Now, some very different roles for militaries here about protecting human rights, about promoting welfare, protecting economies, perhaps international aid, delivering emergency supplies, etc. The 4th type is spelt wrong, I can see, but you can imagine what I'm trying to say, ecological security is this version of climate security is perhaps what you find in the original scientific Earth systems science about critical ecosystems, that what is existentially threatened is the functioning of the Earth system itself, the biosphere. Of course, that's perhaps also what's on the minds of certain NGOs or social movements beyond the scientists, but also certain governments and indigenous populations who identify in a different way with the natural world around them. And there, the thing that is threatened is the biodiversity or other critical boundaries that are associated with the ecosystems. And what is doing the threatening is again, the greenhouse gases, which surprisingly arrive very late in this debate about climate security, but also land grabs, which might come out of some of the measures designed to deal with climate change. So, for example, if we end up trying to use natural solutions to capture gigatons of carbon and store it through afforestation or changes in land use, that's going to require wholesale and massive redistribution of land and use and ownership as well. So all four of these will exist usually in political discourse in a mixture. These are just separated out to give a sort of clearer picture of what's going on and how many different versions of climate security are out there. And then, of course, how many different versions of winning you can extrapolate from those, at least four, but you can add them in various ways. So I would suggest that the debate about the role of the military in climate change, as I've come across it at least, is fairly familiar with types 1, 2, and 3. The idea that militaries need to adapt their equipment, their facilities, but also the range of activities that they need to be able to do to manage security, national security and international security in a climate altered world. Maintaining security in a reconfigured environment, so opening up new theaters, for example, the ice-free Arctic is an obvious one, which is often discussed. But also delivering humanitarian assistance after extreme events. So we've got the sort of human security element there. Peacekeeping interventions in circumstances of displacement and social disruption. Again, that's probably the international security discourse that draws on. Now, the fourth one is more tricky. How might militaries have a role in ecological climate security? In other words, is there a role for the military in protecting the Earth systems themselves, or is it only the effects on societies and on the international system that lend themselves to a notion of climate security? Is it really an sort of inappropriate notion to bring security together with the idea of ecology? You could argue that as a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, relatively, I suppose, decarbonizing militaries as part of a sort of broad proliferation of net zero targets, most of them by mid-century. Most of the world's economy is now under at least a political declaration to achieve net zero by the middle of this century. Let me just be aware that there might be chats that I'm missing. So, sorry. So, how are militaries going to be able to honor that? And will they, as major users of fossil fuels, be hamstrung if those targets are really taken seriously? The net zero concept implies that you can compensate for carbon emissions with negative emissions. But in the absence of a large-scale net zero technologies, we're looking at net zero basically meaning real zero. And this is this graph here on the right is taken from a report about actually from the US Department of Energy that shows the relationship between the US Department of Defense in dark blue and the rest of the US government's use of fossil fuels. And it's obviously the big one, which is most dependent on the fossil economy. So is there a role in decarbonizing, or is there a threat to military capabilities if decarbonization is really taken seriously? Is there a role in enforcing climate agreements? I mean, we've gotten used to the idea that environmental politics is low politics, security politics is high politics. Low politics would not necessarily normally be associated with military action, with extraordinary measures, but high politics is. So what happens when the low politics issue of climate becomes high politics climate security? Will there be, this is purely speculative obviously, will there be a climate role for the military in terms of dealing with international tensions that are due to decarbonization? So not necessarily the direct implications of climate change, but the measures taken to tackle it, e.g. if trade, if climate and carbon issues become stipulated parts of trade regimes or trade wars, or if major adaptation infrastructure creates geopolitical tensions. And finally, which is my area of research at the moment, where I don't know the answers to this, but the direct interventions in climate that are now being looked at, given the climate security discourse that has arrived, what will the role of militaries be in that sphere, if at all? Now, first, I'm just going to quickly say something. How much time do I have? Something about what these climate interventions or geoengineering are. Large-scale intentional intervention in Earth systems, typically for the purpose of altering the climate. So you may not have heard about these particularly, you may have heard about them. These are some of the reasons why they might be considered, but given the time, I think I'm just going to give you a flavor for some of the technologies that are currently being imagined. I'm calling them imaginaries because they don't actually exist, but they feature in climate models and they feature as scientific explorations and theories. So ice restoration technologies to try to shore up or re-establish ice cover to prevent positive feedback loops in terms of global heating. Various technologies being looked at there, including silicate balls being spread across oceans. The big one actually is the one on the right here, stratospheric aerosols, probably the leading solar geoengineering imaginary at the moment, which envisions the injection of sulfates or another aerosol into the lower stratosphere to try to filter out a small percentage of incoming sunlight or sun energy to thereby artificially cool the planet. This is being examined. One of the first outdoor experiments is about to happen in Sweden. The delivery mechanisms to get things into the lower stratosphere are still to be worked out. One idea is that modified military aircraft would be the best suited to flying up to deliver millions of tons of sulfur per year. Other suggestions have included giant tethered balloons that have 20 kilometer long feed pipes that dangle down from these balloons, and through which a slurry of some kind is pumped up and ejected into the stratosphere. It sounds very science fictiony, but this is actually increasingly being taken seriously in climate policy circles. Marine cloud brightening is another one where seawater is being envisaged as something that can be used to spray up particles and change the colors of the clouds, changing the albedo or the reflectivity of the Earth. Space mirrors used to be a popular theory, but has disappeared slightly off the radar due to cost and feasibility concerns.
And with that, oh, go ahead.
With that, my conclusion is that I'm offering is that climate security is the future, it's the present, but it can mean a lot of different things. And that not everything you hear about climate conflict should be taken at face value. But that there may be surprises ahead, as our last speaker emphasized, concerning climate security and expanded demands on militaries. My questions, which I would love to hear other experts answer, is what tactical or strategic value or implications some of these technologies might have. But I guess that would be something for discussion in coffee groups, in coffee rooms, or perhaps in the discussion time afterwards. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Corry. And for everyone here, we just want to highlight our appreciation for you being a part of this conversation, and to our panelists for being in this conversation. Like many of our online events, we press up against time, but as we are looking at questions, I hope that we are feeding them and that our panelists were responding as well. But I do want to highlight that you can always reach out to active members on LinkedIn and Twitter, so be sure to follow them. And again, we appreciate the opportunity today.